Yo guys, Ponchy here, and today I wanted to kind of give you an overview of how I use my Big Six mixer as an interface with my computer for recording and basically everything I do, including recording this audio right now. So a little bit of background, I used to use a Universal Audio Apollo X4, but since I got the Big Six, things have changed up a little bit, so I want to show you how I have things set up. All right, so here is my Big Six. You can clearly see that I'm recording the audio through here. I have it in channel 1. So quick overview about how I'm recording my mic. I have a little bit of EQ on right now. Sometimes I use the compressor, sometimes I just compress in post, but I find that if I use this compressor, it does add a little bit of noise if it's kind of noisy at the moment, like you can hear cars or whatever. So I don't always use that compressor specifically for recording video audio, microphone audio, but I definitely use that when I'm tracking for different things like, bass and a couple other things. Specifically bass, I use it for the most. But anyway, a quick overview of my I/O. So I have a little mini 4-channel snake here going to my patch bay. So that way, if I ever need to record microphones, I just plug them into my patch bay and then they go straight to here. So I don't have to be unplugging these. Not only is a patch bay super convenient, but I want to put as little stress as possible on these connections here. I do realize they are designed to take a lot of plugging and unplugging, but at the same time, I want to preserve this thing for as long as possible. These 1/4-inch inputs here, though, I also use those occasionally. However, I don't have these hooked up to the patch bay, as you can see. I will do that eventually, but as of right now, I don't use those 1/4-inch connections as much, so I don't have them hooked up to the patch bay. And you'll see why here in a sec. So the stereo channels, these are really interesting. The 4 stereo channels, that gives you a total of 8 inputs. So there's a couple different ways to look at this. So right here you can see there's a mono switch. Oh, it's a little washed out there, but there you go. You can kind of see that there's a mono switch there. So the interesting thing about mono is you could have 2 different mono things plugged into here, switch it to mono, and then as long as you're not recording them simultaneously or playing them simultaneously, I mean, you can, but to me, I'd rather keep them separate. But anyway, you can use 2 different mono inputs into 1 stereo input. So that's super nice using the mono switch. But other than that, I mostly reserve these for things like my synths, anything that requires a stereo input. The interesting thing about these first 4 channels versus the stereo channels is that the first 4 channels have the compressors on them, but these 4 stereo channels do not. That seems to work out pretty well for me. I don't end up compressing these stereo things like going into the Big Six at all. So that seems to work out for me. One thing I also forgot to mention real quick about the mono inputs here, I mentioned hooking these up to a patch bay eventually. The thing about that is you would have to press this line button to switch back and forth between the XLR and the line inputs. So that's one thing you got to keep in mind. You would not be able to record XLR and line at the same time, which, that's not a limitation of the Big Six. That's just how things are. I don't want this to go too long, so just a couple more things to keep in mind. You have a phase flip switch here. I don't use that a ton. Only if I'm recording with mics, of course. Or recording drums. So I use these stereo cues here you have two stereo cues. I use those essentially as for effects or for outboard stuff. I don't have a ton of outboard gear, but I do have a little lunchbox with some 500 series modules in them. Just like, you know, simple stuff, an EQ, a compressor. Well, I have a couple EQs, but so I have stereo Q1 set up to go to the lunchbox, and then I have stereo Q2 set up to just go to any kind of pedal that I want. Right now I have it hooked up to a Roland Space Echo, or I should say the Boss one, the Boss version. So that's what I use that for, and then I can easily swap that out for any other pedal if I need. But you know, I don't really use that specifically for like guitar pedals. I just use that Space Echo specifically as an echo, a delay, and reverb for my synths. So that's essentially what I use that for. And then over here in the monitoring section, this is where things get interesting. It gets kind of confusing at first when you're not used to it. But essentially I have the two headphone outputs right here. They plug in up here, so you can have two separate mixes. And then, you know, you can send different things to the headphones as well. Right down here is where the monitors are controlled. I can mute the monitors. I can dim it. The nice thing about that is it has a variable dim, so you can choose how much you want it to dim the monitors. I also have Alt here, which is super handy because you can hook up a totally separate pair of monitors to the Alt section right here. So I have that currently hooked up to an Avantone Mix Cube. So I use that to just kind of double check the mid-range, you know, when I'm recording, or when I'm mixing rather. You can also set the monitors to mono. That's really handy for me right now because I only have one mix cube at the moment. So when I switch to Alt, I also have to switch to mono, so that way I can hear my mix coming through, you know, the one mix cube. So, and then of course here's the master fader. You can choose different things that are sent to it. I'm not using bus B right now. Not going to go over that at the moment. I do use the G series bus compressor all the time because that thing sounds amazing. It does have an auto release that you can set. It also has an auto attack. Essentially, it is kind of an automatic compressor, which, you know, works most of the time. I'm sure in some situations it might not be what you want exactly, but it definitely gives you some of that SSL sound, which is really nice. And that's a big reason that I got this mixer in the first place. A couple more things. You do have one more input here for a talkback mic, which also has its own compressor. So you can use this to record, which I haven't messed around with too much yet, but essentially it gives you a 5th XLR input to record, which also has phantom power. And then up here you have 2 more pairs of external inputs. So the thing about these is you don't have any kind of EQ. You can't use the stereo cues. You know, you can't pan them or anything like that. So those, to me, these, you know, not only do they give you 2 extra pairs, but you know, these are mostly for, essentially, you could just plug in like something simple into it that you don't need to process a bunch, you know, like the other ones here. The biggest thing that I use that for is actually for summing. So that's where things get interesting. That's a big reason why I bought this thing from the get-go, is for summing. So when you sum with the Big Six, you have to completely kind of change up how you're running it for recording. So the biggest change that you have to do is you have to come up here and set all of these to from USB. And then you can also have the external inputs come from USB. Right here, there's these two switches that say external 1 from USB 13 and 14 and external 2 from USB 15 and 16. So with that in mind, you have 4 channels here, you have 8 here, and then you have another 4 inputs here. So you do get a total of 16 inputs that you can use for summing. So the way I approach summing on this thing is I basically set the channels to groups. So like, for example, you know, I want the drums to be in stereo, and I probably want, you know, maybe to EQ a little bit, or maybe compress a little bit here to kind of get some of that SSL compression. So I'll maybe use, for example, I'll use channels 1 and 2 for the drums, and then of course you got to pan those. I'll use channel 3, for example, for the bass. So if I have multiple mics recording the bass, like a DI and a mic or whatever it may be, I'll send all of those channels to channel 3. Channel 4, I'll set it for maybe the guitar. And then channels 5 through 12, you know, I'm free to use those for like all the synths, maybe the vocals. You know, it also depends on, I should mention, it also depends on if I'm running vocals. So for example, if I'm running vocals, maybe I'll put the guitar on channel 5 and 6, for example, because you know, if I have like stereo guitars, then I can do that. You know, you can still, of course, run mono through here, like I mentioned, so it just depends. And then I'll reserve channel 4 for the vocals, so that way I have access to the compressor and, you know, the EQ and possibly the stereo cues. Keep in mind all of these channels here, except for the external inputs, can use the stereo cues and the EQ. So that's about it. You know, that I want to just leave this as a kind of a quick overview. I know it started to go a little bit longer, but if you have any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment down below and ask me any questions. If you're thinking about getting a Big Six, definitely ask me whatever questions you may have. You know, this thing is definitely super different than recording with a normal interface. But once you figure it out and once you get it running with your setup, it's definitely worth it, in my opinion. And I mean, for the price, this is about as cheap as you can go for an actual recording console. And, you know, the good thing about that is it's made by SSL, who's obviously their reputation precedes them. So one last thing I want to mention. I did mention before that I have a Apollo X4. So I do still use that, essentially because I can use that to continue to use my UAD plugins. So all I have to do is turn it on and I can use my UAD plugins even though I'm recording from here. The only thing you can't do, of course, is record using the preamps, you know, where essentially you're using the UAD plugins going into Logic or whatever DAW you use. Obviously, you would need to plug stuff into the X4 to be able to do that. But, you know, in this case, I just use the UAD plugins after tracking, really. You know, I don't use the UAD plugins a ton going into. But obviously, if I ever want to, it's still there. I have 4 inputs on the X4. So that way I can, if I want to record, you know, using a Neve preamp going straight in to the Apollo, then I can do that. But, you know, I don't really do that a ton, so I just use the UAD plugins after the fact, after recording. So that's how I use the Big Six. Again, if you have any kind of questions, leave them down below, and I will see you in the next video.